Okay, so then if sin provides happiness, and obviously the gospel is that we're not to sin, is that by definition then God not wanting us to be happy?
Yeah. Right. No.
Okay.
As I've said before, the devil's in the details.
Right, exactly.
You're listening to the Prepared to Answer podcast. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And just a reminder that all the resources mentioned in this episode are linked in the episode description. You can find other related resources on our website at preparedtoanswer.org. And don't forget that we recently put out a new video series called So Much More Than Sex that will help you discover God's beautiful and eternal purpose for your sexuality. Check it out through the link in the description.
Welcome to another Prepared to Answer podcast. I'm your host, Shawn Walker, and I'm joined by Scott. How are you, Scott?
Hello. Good morning. Yes, good again.
Yes, good to have you back in the studio. We actually just did a podcast with Matt Belfay from...
You did?
I did.
Yeah.
By myself.
I was not in the room.
I know. It was scary. It was very scary.
Yeah, Matt.
Oh.
Matt's always a good conversation.
Yeah, we had a great conversation about doubt.
Yeah.
And so encourage our listeners to catch that. We were talking about different types of doubt. Great conversation. And he is actually changing his ministry name.
Yeah, some exciting change for Matt.
Yeah.
Over at Truth Snack, soon to be a different name.
Yes. Doubters welcome.
Yeah.
Which encourage our listeners again to go check it out. We kind of talk about why the change was happening.
Right. Which is a great, it's always hard to change something that's you get used to, but I think a really good strategic move for him.
Yeah.
Because it really reflects the spirit and the mission of his ministry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, for sure.
In so many ways.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And not that we talked about it on the podcast, but afterwards I was talking to him about just the response that he's gotten from some of the listeners. And he was really encouraged. He had someone kind of respond to him and talk about the fact that, he was a doubter.
Right.
And he could find a lot of stuff online about answering the doubts, right? Answering the questions. Mm-hmm. But what this person really appreciated about Doubters Welcome, True Snack, was the journey that Matt goes on with doubters. Right? That it isn't, here's the answer, your doubt is solved, but that it's actually a journey. So great ministry, and we just love what the Lord's doing at Doubters Welcome.
Yeah, so there's a plug. Go over, check it out at Doubters Welcome.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, but today, Scott, we're kind of pivoting. We've done quite a few, I want to call it heavy episodes. Can we say heavy episodes?
Are there any that we haven't done that are heavy?
That's right.
Yeah. So, we like to challenge. We like to deal with challenging subjects. Yeah. Important ones.
Yeah, exactly. So, and today's an important subject.
It is.
It's a little different. Happiness.
We're going to talk about happiness.
We're going to be happy the whole time.
That's right. Well, we're always happy.
Sure.
But now we're going to talk about it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the question is, does God want us to be happy? Mm-hmm. And what really is driving this actually was Gallup put out their 2024 happiness survey, happiness report.
Yeah.
Worldwide report. And so we love reports, we love numbers, we love diving into what culture is saying about the state of our world. And this was kind of a report on happiness.
Well, and I think that was certainly a catalyst for the conversation. I think behind that also too is that I think in the common mind of the culture, and maybe even broadly within Christianity, I think there is a strong sense or a strong belief that, in the end, what God is really desires is our happiness.
Right.
And as with most things, there's some truth to that, but as I've said before, the devil's in the details.
Right. Exactly.
Right? Yeah. But the Gallup report was something that came across our desk, and we looked at that. This is really an interesting cultural observation.
Yes.
But I think it lends itself to a bigger conversation for us as Christians.
Yes.
So you did a little looking. I mean, you looked into that
survey. Yep.
That was in March, the Gallup World Happiness Report. Probably most people don't know that such a thing exists.
No, that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, and it was fascinating. And I hoping throughout our talk today that we can kind of touch on some of those things that came out of the report. But I think what was most stark for us was the fact that for the first time in their history of kind of doing this report was that they found that young people in North America were the most unhappy.
Interesting.
Yeah. And so what they usually find is, and it's actually kind of funny, is they graphic and they say, happiness dependent on age. And usually they're happier when you're younger. You kind of get to midlife, not so happy. Right.
As you get older, there's more to complain about.
Right. But then as you get even more older, you get more happy. And so when you actually look at this graph, it looks like a smiley face. And that's what they said was interesting, was a smiley face. Not so for North America anymore. It's starting at the bottom with the most unhappy being the youngest within our culture.
Interesting.
Right.
Interesting.
Yeah. And so it kind of makes us sit back and go, well, why is that? And of course, the survey goes into all kinds of different
Now,
reasons.
is that a global phenomenon? Is that around the...
No, this would be North America.
So this is a North America phenomenon that this year's happiness report is showing that the leading generation or the youngest generation are the least happy.
Yes, in North America.
Wow.
Yeah.
So where do we rate, like in terms of Canada, where do we rank?
Sure. For our country, for the rankings in the world, we would be 15.
So we're the 15th happiest country in the world.
Happiest country in the world.
That's not bad.
Number 1, Finland.
Finland.
Yes.
Oh,
and then followed by Denmark, Iceland, and Sweden.
Oh, interesting. Okay, so like the
Scandinavian country. Now the U.S. was 23. So the first time that they had dropped actually below 20. So they've dropped in their happiness index.
Okay.
But what was interesting, and we just mentioned about young people, for those under 30, Canada ranks 58.
So nationally, we rank 15th.
Right. But if we look at just a young segment of our demographic, we then drop significantly to 58.
Okay, so that aligns then with what you're saying. The general finding is that the happiness level of the younger generation is markedly lower.
Right. Right.
Whereas historically, it would have been high. It would have dropped kind of to the middle age and then go back up again.
Right.
For your senior ages.
Yeah. So
so something's happening.
It is. And we've talked a little bit about it. And the fear is that Christians might react and go, well, that's because people are walking away from the faith. That's the reason why they're not happy.
Well, no, I think that might be a knee-jerk response that many Christians might jump on that data and say, well, look, that just correlates with what we are seeing. Yeah, I think we as Christians, we tend to, like everyone, we filter things quickly through the narrative we already have in place.
Right.
I think that's just too simplistic to say, well, the reason why the youngest generation is because our culture is now further away from its Christian moorings to the degree that it ever had Christian moorings.
Right.
I think that's just too simplistic. I think there has to be more going on than just that.
For sure. For sure. But then what that's generated in us is then this question of happiness.
Right.
That we alluded to at the start.
Yeah.
Right. So if our knee-jerk reaction is to say, well, it's because people are walking away from the faith, well, what would Christ think about happiness? Is that what our goal is as Christians? Does God ultimately want us to be happy? And if we were to go to the survey and say, well, the problem is because people don't have Christ, because if they had Christ, they would be happy.
Yeah. Yeah. No, when I look at these kinds of surveys, I mean, the problem with surveys is they are descriptive only. They tell you here's what people are saying. Here are the responses. It's hard to then go from correlation to causation.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes, our culture is that much further away from Christianity than ever before in its history.
True.
And yes, happiness levels are the lowest. Those things correlate, but is there a causation between them? And I'm not convinced it's that simple. For one thing, because I think the data that's not consistent across the board. That's true for North American young people. Is that true for young people in like Finland, which is number one, or the Scandinavian countries, or Europe at large? I think that's too simplistic.
Yeah.
Yeah, there has to be more to it. I think maybe it forces us to maybe ask some more critical questions about happiness and God's purpose for us.
Right.
Now, what I'm curious to know, and Shawn, you looked at the data more closely than I did. This is Gallup. This is a secular institution doing happiness. So what's their scale? How do they measure happiness? What are their metrics for gauging happiness?
Right. And so their leading metric was this life satisfaction, that people were living their best life. And so they would basically go to someone and said, on a scale of 0 to 10, 10 being the best life you can imagine for yourself, how would you rank your life right now? And so people would obviously give a response on that scale. The other two metrics that they used were positive emotions and negative emotions, in that, are you generally positive? So are things well? Are you not anxious and things like that? And then on the negative side, do you feel anger? Do you feel worry, anxiety, and all that kind of stuff? And so those were kind of the next two layers to their questions, were how often do you feel those emotions? And then they factored those in.
Okay.
So they've used these measurements, and we were talking about that knee-jerk response to the younger generation moving away or not being as happy as they're moving away from their faith. But if we look at the top, 3 or 4 countries within this survey, it appears that they're not Christian nations, right? I mean, these are secular nations. So that would almost argue that you can be happy in the way that they've defined it without God.
Well, let's ask the question.
Yeah.
All right. Can you be happy without God? And I'd be interested to know, our listeners are tuning in.
Yeah.
What your initial reaction to that question would be. Can we be happy without God?
I think someone would say, well, truly happy?
Well, what do you mean?
Right.
Truly happy.
Yeah.
I think we need to be careful as Christians that we think carefully about these things. When I think about something that Paul said in Acts 14, he's speaking to unbelievers because he's appealing to them, trying to persuade them to come to Christ. But he says, in the past, God let all nations go their own way, right? He has not left himself without testimony, though. He has shown kindness by giving you, he's talking to unbelievers, by giving you rain from heaven and crops in their seasons. He provides you with plenty of food and fills your hearts with joy. God, in his grace, gives good gifts, right? Jesus said he causes his sun and rain to shine and fall upon believers and unbelievers. God gives tokens of his goodness to unbelievers and believers alike. And those things are satisfying. They can make us happy.
So it appears Paul is saying unbelievers can be happy.
Well, if God gives gifts, which he says fills their hearts with joy, those are unbelievers.
Yeah.
Then it would seem, even though they're not acknowledging God, they're happy.
Yeah.
And I mean, let's face it. If people did not find happiness apart from God, evangelism would be a cinch. It would be like shooting fish in a barrel.
That's very good point.
Look, all we have to do, you're not happy.
Yes.
Here's the way to happiness.
Yeah.
And I think we have to be careful of that, because that's not the gospel.
Right. So, Scott, I would be remiss if we didn't stop, and we have gone so far in this conversation without doing something that we do on a regular basis.
Yeah, that's right.
We need to define what happiness is. We're throwing this word around. It's crazy.
It's Scott's dictionary time.
What is happiness? Like when we talk about happiness.
Yeah. Well, we're not going to go to the dictionary, because actually the dictionary doesn't give us a whole lot of help there.
Okay.
Other than saying it's a feeling of contentment and satisfaction, which just kind of restates it. I came across a book called The How of Happiness, written by a positive psychology researcher, describing, and this is the description, this researcher describes happiness as the experience of joy, contentment, or positive well-being, combined with a sense that one's life is good, meaningful, and worthwhile. And I mean, generally speaking, I think that's probably a fair definition. And if I could probably maybe just paraphrase what she's saying there, I would say that happiness is our response. It's our response to experiencing or attaining or receiving or achieving what we desire most.
I think that's a fair definition. Yep.
When we achieve that or receive that or get that, it makes us happy.
Yeah.
And but see, that's precisely our peril apart from Jesus. And this is why, again, I think we don't want to be too simplistic with the gospel, because if we look at really what the gospel is saying, about our state outside of Christ, the very peril we're in, the reason we're caught and trapped in sin is because it makes us happy apart from God.
Yeah.
That's the deception, that I found something in that which is not ultimate, which is the creation in one way, shape, or form, but I'm treating it as though it's ultimate.
Right.
Right? And I'm finding my satisfaction in it. And let's face it, again, if sin didn't make us happy,
We wouldn't be doing
we
it.
wouldn't be doing it. It would be easy to convict people of their sin
Right.
and demonstrate or show them that it's wrong.
Right. So out of that definition then, this happiness, well, sinful happiness, is temporary. Would that be fair?
Well, sure. Now we're starting to get into what the heart of the gospel gets to. That yes, sin makes us happy,
Yes.
but it's deadly.
Right. Right.
Right?
Yes. Okay. So then if sin provides happiness, and obviously the gospel is that we're not to sin, is that by definition then God not wanting us to be happy?
Yeah. Right. No.
Okay. Okay.
No. And I
Use
think,
it.
again, we have to be careful. I think
Yeah.
sometimes we set up false dichotomies. We set up things
Okay.
like happiness and holiness
Or
against each other.
Yeah.
Right? Like, no. And I'm guilty of this before, Shawn. I've said things like this, and I realize now they're much too trite and they're not clarifying enough. I've said things like, God doesn't want us to be happy. He wants us to be holy.
Right. Yes. Where you're setting it up against each other.
Yeah. And it's almost
Yeah.
like, really? Oh. So we'll be holy, but we won't be happy.
Which I fear that culture, the world looks on Christianity and goes, well, that's what it is.
Right.
They don't want people to be happy.
Right. We're
Right.
going to heaven with sour expressions on our face.
Right.
What a bunch of sour pusses.
Right.
Right. When in
Yeah.
fact, I mean, if we look biblically, if we look at the life of Jesus, who is the reflection of God's own being,
Yeah.
Jesus was the happiest person who ever lived.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, even something, here's something Paul says in 1 Timothy 1:11. He's speaking to Christians. He says, we know the law is good if one uses it properly. We also know that the law is not made for the righteous, but for the lawbreakers and for whatever else is contrary to sound doctrine that conforms to the gospel. And this is the key part. This is the gospel concerning the glory of the blessed God, which he's entrusted to me. That term that Paul says, the glory of the gospel of the blessed God, the word he uses there, the Greek word makarios, is actually the word happy.
Oh, okay. Okay, interesting.
He's basically saying the glory of the happy God.
So would that translate to the Beatitudes?
Yeah.
Okay.
Happy, Jesus said, are the poor in spirit. Right? Like sometimes I think we think of blessed as it's some kind of,
Halo or something?
yeah, like there's a halo effect.
Right.
Blessed are the miserable.
right. Exactly. Yeah.
Happy are the poor in spirit now,
Huh.
right? Because they will inherit the kingdom of heaven. Happy are those who mourn, for they will be comforted.
Okay, but that is complete opposite.
Well,
For us, happy are those that mourn. Is not mourning the opposite of happiness?
well, and I think this bumps up against maybe our notions of happiness, but also what is the root of happiness? From what do we derive our sense of happiness? And if it's not in that which is ultimate, right? Sinners are happy,
Right.
but they're happy now.
Okay.
Their happiness is fleeting.
Temporary,
It's temporary. It's ultimately built on sand.
which we would see. There's evidence of that.
Right.
We see happy people all the time, but then also we see them not happy,
Mhm.
right? And often the things that they are happy in are ultimately their downfall.
Right. Yes, and I guess part of the challenge is the happiness of sin is an immediate happiness. I
Okay.
immediately get what makes me
Okay.
happy, right?
Yes.
Right now.
Yep.
But the other thing too, and I think we learned this by experience. It's like you said, it's fleeting.
Yeah.
Because I got what I wanted now. It makes me happy, but it's also a temporary happiness. So I have to continually
Keep getting more.
Keep getting more.
Yes.
the Beatitudes they point to happiness that's rooted in something future. Right. But I think we'd be wrong then to conclude that, well, so that means misery now.
Right.
Until, right? We won't be happy until.
Yes.
But again, I don't think that doesn't reflect what Jesus is saying. I don't think that reflects the gospel.
Yes.
Nor does it reflect true Christian experience. That's not our Christian experience now. And of course, and Jesus even speaks to this, right?
Yes.
Jesus says in John 15, I've told you these things so that my joy may be in you and that your joy may be complete. That's a present tense. That's a current life experience.
So with that present reality, though, there's a tension there, right? That Jesus is talking about a present joy, a present happiness. Mm-hmm. And when we're looking at this world survey and what we deem happiness, we're thinking that, or we're talking about the fact that might be driven by sin, that they're temporary things that are making us happy. And yet Christ is talking about this present tense happiness that we can have in him.
Yeah.
And that seems to be, there might be a bit of tension between the two. And I thought maybe we could dive into a little bit on Christian hedonism.
That's a John Piperism, yeah.
That's a John, and our listeners will know that often
we're big fans.
We're big fans of John Piper.
Yeah.
Where he talks about happiness in God. Mm-hmm. And maybe you can talk a little bit to that. And maybe would that provide a little bit of a key to what Christ is talking about in terms of current?
Yes. I don't think it would. I don't think it would provide a key. I think it would provide the key.
Okay.
To differentiating true happiness from worldly happiness.
Okay.
Yes. Okay. So Christian hedonism. Hedonism is kind of that's a secular, worldly term, referring to someone who is a pleasure seeker.
Right.
Right. And usually, it's when we use it, it's used in the most secular and materialistic and pleasure seeking sort of way.
Yeah.
Piper, he co-opts that term and Christianizes it by making God the focus of our pleasure seeking. So, and this is in his book, Desiring God. I'll just read, I'll let him explain it. He says, the pleasure that Christian hedonism seeks is the pleasure that is in God himself. He is the end of our search, not the means to some further end. Our exceeding joy is he, the Lord, not the streets of gold, right? Not reunion with relatives or any of the blessings of heaven, right? Some kind of future, right? Utopia. Christian hedonism does not reduce God to a key that unlocks a treasure chest of gold and silver somewhere or sometime. Rather, it seeks to transform the heart so that the Almighty, as Job says in Job 22, the Almighty will be your gold and your precious silver. Wow. So what Christian hedonism does, it's essentially transforming our hearts so that the center of our joy and happiness is what is the center of Christ's joy, Jesus' joy and happiness, which is God himself. Right? That which gives God the greatest joy and satisfaction is, in fact, his own glory. Because we've said this before, if God is the greatest possible good, right, that one could ever attain or achieve or conceive of, then if God is going to be truly happy, God will be most pleased in himself.
Right.
Just as if we are to be most happy, or if God is to bring us to a place of ultimate happiness, we will find our happiness, true happiness, in him. But that's the thing, is that's not just a future reality for the Christian, right?
Right.
That's something that Christ invites us into now, so that my joy, that is the joy of the Son, the joy that Jesus enjoys as the eternal Son of the Father, right? Enjoying forever the fellowship of love within the glory of the Trinity, that joy he wants to make our joy.
Right.
The enjoyment of God.
Right. And what's amazing about that is not only is it temporal right now, but it's eternal. It is a happiness that will fulfill us for all time in eternity, where, like we were speaking before, we find that the happiness we find in the world is temporal.
Right.
That it's fleeting. And I think for people it's frustrating and it brings people down, right? That I have something I'm happy about, but it doesn't make me really happy. Right. It's gone. The shine on the new car is gone. That relationship I'm in is no longer exciting. And those things disappear.
Well, and like anything, I mean, let's face it, you're exactly right. And when we think about the things we pursue that make us happy. I've observed this in my own life. Any kind of thing, experience, whether it's food or drink or vacations or whatever, you experience it once, and the next time it doesn't quite have the same impact. There's this diminishing scale of return for anything we experience in life.
Yeah.
And so then, and I think that often becomes the root of addictions.
Sure.
In their many ways, shapes, and forms.
Yeah.
Because we want that.
Next.
I want the feeling it gave me last time.
But even more.
Right, but more so.
Yeah.
But there then also is the great gift we have in God, is that as finite creatures, God's goal for us, his eternal reward for us, is himself, is coming to enjoy his glory forever.
Yes.
He, the infinite God. We can never, there's no diminishing scale of return with God. There's only an increasing, because we're finite creatures, it will take us eternity to ever exhaust the depths and the riches of God's glory.
Yeah.
But that's the beauty of the Christian life, is it starts now, as we can pursue the enjoyment of God and his glory and who he is in the here and now.
Right.
Through Christ Jesus.
Right. So the big question is how? How do we pursue that? How do we enter into that joy? Because I'll be honest, Scott, I mean, I look at Scripture, I look at Paul and his ability to be content in all situations, no matter what. And I think, wow, that would be amazing to be there. And I look around our world and go, that's what everyone is pursuing, is this contentment, this happiness that lasts, that Paul found, but that is promised in Scripture.
Yeah, that's a tough question. How? Or that's the important. That's probably the most important question of how.
Yeah.
I don't want to speak as though I've got it all figured out. This is something I'm still pursuing. But in my pursuit, there are probably at least 4 things that I have seen are important to help move me in that direction.
Sure.
The first thing I would say is this. I think we need to stop and take a critical look regularly, critically look at our own hearts and ask ourselves, what is it that really makes me happy? And I think as Christians, it's easy to say, oh, God makes me happy, right? That's the easy Sunday morning answer to give.
Sure.
I think the way to do that is to critically look at your own life and see, where do you spend most of your mental time and emotional energy, your resources? Where is that expended? Where does your mind and your heart go when it's not occupied by, the mundane things of life, like work and family responsibilities and the things that take our attention?
When we have free time.
Right.
Yeah.
When you have free time, where does your heart go for rest and refreshment? And Shawn, I'm not preaching to anyone, because I will admit, when I'm looking for rest, often I flop down in front of the TV and binge watch Netflix because it puts my mind into neutral and I find that relaxing. Well, that says something about myself.
Sure.
I've not yet come to the place where God is my greatest source of joy and delight. Because if he were, I'd go immediately to him. And that's where I would find refreshment. And as the Bible talks about springs of living water, Jesus talked about, right?
Yes.
That sounds so great.
Yeah.
And yet I think sometimes we as Christians, we get lazy maybe. Yeah. And we don't think about these things enough. So that would be first, is to say, where does my mind
take an inventory?
Go? Yeah, take an inventory.
Yeah. Okay.
So the second thing then is, maybe in line with that, is to recognize that, if God is to be the greatest source of my joy, and so instead of going to Netflix to binge,
right.
So then what do I do with my time? Well, and this is, I think, where worship and prayer and Bible study.
Yeah.
These are the things that should occupy our spare time.
Sure. Yeah.
If God is our greatest source of joy, and you think, oh, that sounds like, you sound like
a Christian answer.
Yeah, you sound like Charlie Church. But why?
Right.
Right? Why, if God is the greatest source of my happiness, if God is the great reward, right? If the joy of Jesus is to be my joy, like when Jesus wasn't occupied, I wonder what he did. Well, the Gospels would seem to indicate he prayed a lot.
Sure.
He went off by himself and spent time with his Father.
Yeah.
then how ought that be any different for us? So I think things like worship and Bible study and, and study and reading and prayer.
Sure. And when we say worship, maybe we can expand that a little apart from a Sunday morning. Like I often find worship in a walk in the woods.
Sure. Yeah.
Or in a good meal that has been made by loving hands and tastes amazing. And there's worship there, but there's a focus.
Right. And those are the things God's given us to bring us joy.
Right.
But again, the joy is that they point us towards his goodness. Right. And there's the satisfaction. Right? If you look for the satisfaction in the meal, it's over.
Right. It's done. Yes.
Can't wait for the next meal.
Yes.
Right? Maybe I'll get that feeling back. But no, the satisfaction is in, God, thank you. And you know what? There have been times where I've done that. I've realized that was just a gift.
Yeah.
Right? A good meal. I mean, I love a good prepared meal.
Sure. Yes.
Don't get me wrong.
Yeah.
But I think the real satisfaction in is knowing this was a gift from God.
Sure.
And enjoying it as such and returning thanks to him.
Yeah.
I mean, and that's just a discipline.
Yeah.
Maybe that we need to develop more and more.
Yeah. Yeah. I'd agree.
Along with that, I think there's something we have to realize. As part of our worship, we realize that God's given us his word.
Yes.
And through his word revealed his glory to us, revealed who he is and the wonder and beauty of his glory. He's done that through Jesus. This is something Paul says in 2 Corinthians chapter 4. He says that the God of this age has blinded the minds of unbelievers so that they cannot see the light of the gospel that displays the glory of Christ, who is the image of God. Mm-hmm. In other words, that in seeing Jesus, looking at Jesus, we see the full glory of God on display for us. Now, we see this through the eyes of faith, but God reveals Jesus to us in the gospel through the scriptures. So that when we study the Bible, when we look into God's word, God by his Spirit opens our hearts and our minds to see the wonder and the beauty and the glory of God in Christ.
Yeah.
I just don't think we can't go around that. We can't bypass that as part of the way that we begin to enjoy the glory of God and as the ultimate source of our happiness here and now, just as we will fully one day when we see Jesus with our eyes, no longer through the eyes of faith, but actually see him when we enter into his presence in glory.
Yes.
Maybe the third thing I'd say is looking for a mentor in this. And again, I'm not gonna apologize for this. John Piper has become for me a real mentor in many ways, but probably this opening my eyes to seeing that the ultimate pursuit of the Christian life is the enjoyment of God's glory, right?
Yeah.
To find him as my greatest source of satisfaction and happiness. And I would just recommend him as, one of many. His mentor was Jonathan Edwards, right? The 17th century theologian who probably, probably was even more profound in many of the things he said. Challenges Edwards is hard to, the English is hard to
read,
right?
Yep.
To read. Piper does a good job, I think, at distilling.
Translating.
Yeah. To that end, I would just recommend, he's written many books. I would recommend as a place to start his book called Desiring God. Meditations of a Christian Hedonist is the subtitle. Yeah. Desiring God is probably one of the most life-changing books that I've read in terms of helping to reshape my mind in that respect.
Yeah.
The last thing I would say, and this is probably maybe even more difficult than finding a mentor like John Piper, is to find real living examples, Christians who actually model it.
Yes.
Which sadly, Shawn, should be most of us.
I know, right?
What the world needs to see is the church as people who are the happiest people in the world.
No matter the circumstance.
No matter the circumstance. And there's this strange happiness and joy to them that you can't put your finger on, but it's because we are satisfied and happy in God.
Yeah. It was interesting. I was talking to a friend that had a friend that worked in closed countries with Christians. And what they said was often these people that had come to Christ in these closed countries, so these would be cultures where, coming to Christianity would not be a good thing, maybe even illegal. And he said often they were outed not because someone outed them, but because other people saw them and said, there is something different about that person. They are a different person.
Yeah.
And they started looking into why that was the case. Come to find out it was Christ.
Right.
Yeah. And that's amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I've mentioned this one. There's probably the most profound example in my own personal life, and I've mentioned this before, was my mother's youngest brother, my uncle. He was a missionary in his 30s, and then they had to come home from the field because he was diagnosed with a degenerative muscle disease that basically put him in a wheelchair for the rest of his life.
Yeah.
And his wife, my aunt, who's still living, who's just such a godly woman, she was a career nurse. And so she faithfully cared for him for his adult life, a wheelchair, right? And it just served as a model for me. This was a man who, you think of what typically makes men feel satisfied is that we can work and provide for our family, and we're with our strength we can do things. And that was all taken from him. And he depended on his wife for his adult life to care for him and their son. But I remember at his funeral, he's passed now, I remember his pastor talking. He had a good relationship with his pastor, and his pastor saying, I used to go and visit him to pray with him, to try to encourage him.
Yeah.
He said, I would always leave encouraged myself. I went to encourage him, but I would leave encouraged because his faith was so strong that he was satisfied in the Lord. And he found his joy. I mean, don't get me wrong, he had bad days.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
But he learned the joy and satisfaction of being in Christ, and that God was his eternal reward.
Yeah.
That God was his satisfaction in Jesus. Finding people like that.
Yes.
And, spending time with them so they rub off on you.
Yeah.
I think that's another way of how do we become that kind of Christian?
Yeah. Yeah. No, what an amazing story, because the world would see your uncle and say he should be very unhappy, discontent, dark, all those types of things.
Right.
What's the difference?
Right.
Christ.
Right.
So, wow, that's amazing.
Yeah.
And a great place to end this episode. Thanks, Scott. I hope you have enjoyed the episode. And as always, if you have any questions about what we've talked about, we'd love to hear from you at info@preparedtoanswer.org. And until next time, God bless.
Thanks for listening to the Prepared to Answer podcast. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And if you have any questions or comments you'd like to share with us, feel free to email us at info@preparedtoanswer.org. Contact us through Facebook or Instagram @preparedtoanswer, or use the contact form on our website, www.preparedtoanswer.org.